Hey, how you doing? I'm at, I think, the world's busiest Quick Trip here on Southwest Boulevard and 31st Street. I'm not feeling too well, so I'm heading home. Go to bed. But on the way home, thought I would do something about Jefferson Highway, which is this road right here. As soon as I can get on it. Oh, look at that sun behind me. Impressive. But Jefferson Highway was an auto trail from 1916 till about 1926. Some would say 1915 to 1926, 26, 27. About the time not interstates, but the U.S. highways came into being, the numbered highways, when the federal government finally took over. Up until the federal government took over control of naming and numbering and maintaining highways, it was up to individuals to do it, actually. And some groups or people did better than others. But what we ended up with before numbered highways was a confusing mass of named roads, and each road had its symbol. And two of the main ones that came through Kansas City are the National Old Trails Road and Jefferson Highway. We're on a branch of the Jefferson Highway right now. This is Southwest Boulevard, and we're heading into Kansas City, into downtown. And this at one time was also known as the Kansas City Road, or Kansas City Fort Scott Road, which is a military road. And actually, it pretty much ran from Leavenworth into Kansas City and then down into Fort Scott. And it was a defensive road. It was used for supplying and supplies and patrol. West of Missouri was Indian territory, what they called Indian territory that was designated for native tribes. But how the federal government and natives got along, and the federal government stole, and long story short, Indian territory became Kansas. And when the Native Americans were pushed into reservations, there wasn't much of a need for a defensive road anymore until the 1850s, about the time of the Civil War, when people from Missouri were trying to head west and start trouble in Kansas territory, bring it in as a slave state. And then during the Civil War, when both sides were fighting, but this is a branch of the Jefferson Highway. Jefferson Highway splits in Kansas City. Actually, it comes together. It splits north of St. Joseph. There's a western branch and an eastern branch. And then it comes together in Kansas City. And then it splits again in Kansas City. And there's a western branch and an eastern branch, or Missouri branch and a Kansas branch. We're on the Kansas branch. And I believe the Kansas branch, they had two branches. Originally, they wanted it to go straight along the state line, pretty much. But that wasn't as well finished, so they followed a lot of the already well-established roads, meaning that when they got into these towns in Kansas, they became paved with cobblestones or whatever. And so they followed that course for a while, but I think they were originally wanted it to be east. And the association oftentimes went up to the towns or the counties and said, okay, if you maintain it, we'll send the highway through here. We'll draw our maps so that it shows the highway going in this area. And the better maintained it was, the more chances you got the highway. And that was important, especially to commercial interests, because if you were on the map, essentially it meant it directed traffic through your town. Now this intersection here, which is what I believe the crossroads is actually named after, this Kansas City Crossroads Arts District, is Broadway is north and south, and Southwest Boulevard is going from southwest to northeast, the way we're going. And Broadway is actually the course of the National Old Trails Road, and this road that we're on is Jefferson Highway. And the irony is that National Old Trails Road is an east-west route, but here it's north and south, and Jefferson Highway is a north-south route, but here it's generally east and west. And there's the sign for the crossroads. But we'll follow this up northeast until we hit Grand, and then we'll turn left and head north. But when this road bends, it becomes 19th Street and heads east, and then 19th and Grand, you turn left or head north. And when you hit well, actually, it's in downtown about 9th Street is where the road splits. There's an eastern branch. It goes through Missouri, Raytown, Lee Summit, Harrisonville, and south towards Carthage, and then west towards Joplin. And that branch, when you hit Carthage and you intersect and start heading west towards Joplin, everybody knows that road. That's Route 66. And so Jefferson Highway and Route 66 are on the same path for quite a ways, from Carthage until you hit Vinita, Oklahoma, and then it heads south towards eastern Oklahoma into Texas, and then it bends east and goes into Louisiana on towards New Orleans. We proposed, I've talked with some people about trying to get it known as the Jazz Highway, and the theory being that many of the jazz musicians that created the Kansas City jazz sound, and thus created music that was well known to the world, came out of the Southwest Territories, places like Oklahoma. And when they traveled into Kansas City, there'd be several ways they would go, but one way would be the Jefferson Highway. And since there are many great jazz cities on the Jefferson Highway, New Orleans, Kansas City, Minneapolis, and Winnipeg, Canada. In just a second, we are now turning left on Grand from 19th Street. And now we're heading north into downtown on Jefferson Highway. But anyway, so the idea is that with the Jazz Highway is that we could promote the jazz heritage of these many cities and also promote the Jefferson Highway at the same time. So there's a Blues Highway, which is Highway 61, and so why not have a Jazz Highway? But this is Grand Avenue, it is a Grand Avenue in Kansas City, one of the main streets in town. And here it heads north into the old, what used to be downtown, which is now the River Market area. Part of it at one time in the 60s and 70s was known as the River Key, until we had the big mafia war in the late 70s, like 1977, that destroyed that area, hindered development for a long time. It's now no longer known as the River Key, but some people still remember it as the River Key, and that's Key, Q-U-A-Y. Get some light on the subject here. I guess a little too much light. But downtown Kansas City. Here we are. This is we just passed through an area they've redeveloped the past 15 years. Power and Light District, named after the Power and Light building. An Art Deco structure that still needs redevelopment. Now I got a little too much light on the subject. And auto trails existed because of their associations, and some were better organized than others. There's some auto trails that are really confusing, like a lot of people have heard of the Dixie Highway. Well, there's so many people who wanted to be included on the Dixie Highway that there's actually something like 4 Dixie Highways. They're all the same association and numbering, but there's 4 different routes, and many of these routes don't have a whole lot to do with each other than they come together, I think, in Florida, because originally the Dixie Highway was meant to link, I think the dream was to link the Midwest to Florida, so that people could drive to Florida and enjoy their vacations. But but people say, well, where is the Dixie Highway? If you look at a map, there's I think there's 4 of them. And Jefferson Highway sort of does that, but not as disorganized. The headquarters city for the Jefferson Highway was St. Joseph. And, it splits into, in Missouri, it splits into the St. Joseph branch and the eastern branch, which roughly, if you follow 169 and 69, you've got it. And the St. Joseph branch, it basically goes to St. Joseph, which is the headquarters city for the Jefferson Highway. And then and here is where it heads. This is the split. Now we're on the part where it's not split. You follow what is it, Admiral, but you can't do that because it's a one-way street in this area. So it was Admiral to Paseo past the 18th and Vine Jazz District, 12th Street and Vine area, and then Paseo to roughly 31st East, until you hit that strange 5-way intersection, and you take the Raytown Road branch, Stadium Drive, Raytown Road, into Raytown. It kind of zigzags and meanders through Raytown, and then starts heading south towards Lee Summit, and then from Lee Summit south to Harrisonville. Now we're in the River Market area. This was the old part of downtown Kansas City. So originally where Kansas City started, the City Hall used to be somewhere over here, and this is the farmer's market over to the left. And downtown shifted south after the 1900s, and I think in the 1930s they built a new City Hall, and they tore down the old City Hall, which, I don't know, is sort of a shame. It looked like it was a beautiful building. And here on 3rd Street, you turn right, and unfortunately my dogs are getting excited because there's a dog park that we like to go to. And I said the word dog park. No doggies. I'm not feeling good enough to take you to the doggy park. I'm sorry. I'm gonna disappoint you. I'm so sorry about that, dogs. And right about here, you'd have to turn left somehow, and I don't know, I have to look at the drawings and maps again, but you crossed over at the ASB Bridge, Armour-Smith Burlington, across the river into North Kansas City. Big truck. And now you cross over here on the Heart of America Bridge. But you can see the ASB Bridge. It's still here. It used to have automobile traffic on the upper deck, but they took that apart away in 1987 when they built this, when they opened this. And there's still trains that go on the lower deck. And that's the ASB Bridge right there. And that was opened, I believe, a little bit before the Jefferson Highway started. I think it was 1911 when it was open for traffic. But they actually started construction on it in the 1880s, and it took them forever. I think there was a bankruptcy and all sorts of stuff. You know, back in the 1800s, people didn't look upon roads as so much of a public enterprise, but they looked upon them more as a private. It was all privatized, if you want to use today's terminology. And let me say that privatization did not work so well. It did not serve the needs of business, did not serve the needs of the public at large. It only served the needs of a few people who could squat on a piece of property and control the access and charge people a fortune to get across areas just because they happen to be sitting on a piece of land that had access to a crossing, like across the Missouri River, for instance. So people for a long time begged and pleaded and lobbied the federal government to do something about that, because you just could not get across the country very easily. And when automobiles started coming into being in the early 1900s, that's when it really came to fruition. I mean, people would go to Europe and they would see public roads. Some of the public roads in Europe have been around for a couple thousand years, actually, since the time of the Roman Empire and before. And you know, when you had an emergency, or when you were trying to march an army across something to defend your land or whatever, good roads really were necessary. But in America, I believe it was Eisenhower who was tasked with going across country just to see what it was like with a convoy. And it took him, I believe, something like, it was either 45 or 90 days. It was ridiculous. And then when he went to Europe during the war and he saw the German Autobahn, he said, we need something like that here in the United States. And that's how we got the interstate system. But before that, you know, we had the U.S. highways. Well, the U.S. highways were getting maxed to their capacity. Many towns that had a U.S. highway, which would be like a 2-lane road through the heart of town, it would get so clogged. Like, I heard, you know, I've been to Holbrook, Arizona, over Route 66, and was told that it was so much traffic and so congested and polluted and everything else that you couldn't even get across the street. Now, I was so busy talking. There's like 3 branches of the Jefferson Highway here. I mean, you can take this. This is fine. This is Burlington. However, the original branch was east of here, a couple blocks, which, you know, basically goes right through the heart of downtown Kansas City, or downtown North Kansas City. And then there was like an older and then a newer, and it's kind of like a meandering river. As roads got improved and better, and people started thinking more about roads in a state of, it's a public interest, and public money should be used to maintain these roads for the public good, something we take for granted today. But back in the early part of the 20th century, it wasn't a given. And there were a lot of private commercial interests who were really against it because they felt like it's government interference and da-da-da. You know, of course, a lot of these people who were against it were personally making a fortune off of the status quo. And that's always the story. You know, there's a lot of people who resist change because the status quo is good for them personally, but bad for everyone else. But we're just going to take North Oak and follow it north until I have to turn to go home. But I don't know, in my rambling and distraction, where I got on the Holbrook story, but essentially it was so congested that you couldn't even cross the street during the day without taking your life in your hands. And that was, there's a place called Joe and Aggie's. It's a little Mexican restaurant there. It's been there for a while. And that's where we heard that story. They remember when Route 66 was still around, still the main highway, and the interstate wasn't there yet. Jefferson Highway was never really that congested. Although you can imagine if we didn't have US 169, which is to the west of here, and it's also the road that Jefferson Highway more or less created. You can say it was probably the final position of the Jefferson Highway when they get it all settled out. But if that road wasn't here, everybody would be on these roads, and there would be quite a lot of traffic. It wouldn't be so pleasant. And you know, a lot of local businesses might say, "Oh yeah," but you know, most of them probably not, because most of them may be so crowded people wouldn't even want to stop. And there are a lot of people who aren't old enough to remember those days, but I do. I'm just barely old enough. I was a little kid, and I remember some of those roads before interstates came through. And I lived in the south in Biloxi, Mississippi, and I'm thinking of Pass Road, which was an old Spanish road, went right through the middle of Biloxi and Gulfport and all those places. And that was the main highway at one time. And man, I remember in the 70s, that road became so congested that it took you an hour or two just to get 10 miles. Until, you know, I mean, there was US 90, which is right on the coast. But still, when they opened the interstate, they got a lot of that traffic out of there. And I'm sure local business owners and some of the chain stores or whatever were crying about it, but most people were happy. Having said that, I always advise people that when you travel, try and take the back roads when you can, because that's how you see the real America. Or our motto is, me and my wife travel, is take America's back roads. It's where you'll find us, and the us is US in the old US highway shield. And those shields, actually, what they represent is that federal funding is used to it's federally funded and pretty much federally controlled. And where the shields come from, a lot of people don't know this, is it's the federal shield, the seal on the Great Seal of the United States government. It's what represents our government is the shield. You know that shield that the eagle carries on the Great Seal? And so they would put that shield. At first it was just a white shield on the U.S. highways, meaning that federal money was used to maintain and build these roads. And then the interstate highways, it's the red, white, and blue shield. And you know, I guess the way that works and the way it's always worked is that the states actually do the work, but the government gives the states some money for it. And that's why you have, you know, like Missouri, we have Missouri Department of Transportation, Kansas Department of Transportation. You know, every state has that agency that maintains the roads, and they're responsible for maintaining the state, U.S., and interstate highways. And the federal government gives them money for the U.S. and interstate highways. And this is North Oak. We're coming up into Gladstone, but at the time of the Jefferson Highway, Gladstone didn't exist until the 1950s. But at the time of the Jefferson Highway, it was known as Linden. And Linden came into being. A lot of the towns came into being, and forgive me, I don't know the name of the. Maybe somebody can help out on this. I don't know off the top of my head. But there was a little train line that was built for. It was like a late 1800s, early 20th century version of the of a bus system, but it was on rails because there were really not very good roads back then. And usually it was something like a what would be known as a doodle bug, a gas-powered car. It looks kind of like a trolley. It ran sort of like a bus back and forth. And this rail line went between roughly an area where North Kansas City Hospital is, all the way up to St. Joseph. And there was also a branch that ran up to Excelsior Springs, and that's how people got around. And they actually got around in many ways a lot easier. Although, you know, it's public transportation. You become dependent on public schedules. You know, you have to plan your day around when the train would come in. But where the water tower is, and an area south and east of that around downtown Gladstone, is where Linden used to be, and the line used to come on the east side of Linden, the old rail line. And you can see, if you look at a map, the road patterns where you can see the actual grade of the old railroad line. And in Clay County, Missouri, it's Linden, and I'm talking about Jefferson Highway towns. Linden, Nashua, Linden, Gashua, Berry, or Gashland and Berry, Nashua, and Smithville. And then you would head towards Trimble, Missouri, where the highway splits, with the west branch going to St. Joseph and the north branch going roughly along an area that later became Interstate 35. But if you follow, 169, you follow the U.S. highway, kind of zigzags through there. I mean, not exactly, you know. And now we're getting off the Jefferson Highway, so I'll end this. But the old Auto Trails roads didn't have the subtle curve grades. It met at right angles. So like if you would go, like if you were going north, and then it would turn east and then go north and zigzag like that. And the way I understand it is, the reason why is because these auto trail associations were not government entities. They were private associations, and they didn't have the power of eminent domain. They couldn't go up to a homeowner and say, look, or a landowner or property owner and say, look, we need the road to go straight through here, which goes right through your property. We will buy it from you, or we will condemn your property, take what we need, and then give you what we think it's worth. And the associations didn't have the financing or the legal power to do that. You know, of course, that's a very controversial thing, and nobody likes to have their property taken from them, but again, it all falls into the common good. When roads need to take a more subtle curve to prevent people from dying so that people can get to where they're going faster, then, you know, you have to approach the property owner and say, this is what we need. So that's why auto trails meet at right angles when you see them on a map. Generally, there are a few areas where they curve or where they have the right kind of, but also, you know, the auto trails is where the original engineers kind of cut their teeth on how to design and build roads. And they were very experimental. They by the time the U.S. highways came in, a lot of U.S. highways were still dirt roads and auto trails and met at right angles. But they had developed so much that within 20 years, almost all the U.S. highways were paved and graded and proper bridges built and everything else like that. We can thank the auto trails for that. Well, anyway, I am no longer on the Jefferson Highway, although this is 169, which you can argue if you wanted to really take the Jefferson Highway without really taking the Jefferson Highway, you can get on these roads that the Jefferson Highway sort of created, the offspring roads, the children of the Jefferson Highway, which is this U.S. highway, which really through here, it's a limited access 4-lane roadway. It's almost built to interstate standards. But anyway, I will leave it here. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments or suggestions or ideas. Thank you.